Welcome to the Making Kids Count podcast, brought to you by Kentucky Youth Advocates, where we sit down with policymakers, community leaders, and youth to discuss ideas to make Kentucky the best place to be young. Now here's your host, Terry Brooks.
Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Terry Brooks, and this is another Making Kids Count podcast. As you know, during the 2024 legislative session, we hosted a number of podcasts featuring, for instance, Senate and House leadership, chairs of key committees that involved kids, and we also certainly featured many of our partners. So now that the General Assembly has passed, we wanted to do a reflective look back. And in order to do that, we invited two folks, both of whom I so greatly respect in terms of knowing the Frankfurt scene and also carrying themselves in such a smart and ethical way. And those two folks are Shane Noem and Abby Piper. So I already told them before we started that instead of me just reading a bio, I was going to give them a minute or so to just sort of let you know who they are, and then we'll get into the meat of it. So Abby, do you want to open with who in the heck is Abby Piper?
Sure. Thanks for having me today, Terry. Really excited to be on this podcast and to look back on some of the wins and losses of the session. I think it's going to be a really fun podcast. So thank you so much. My name is Abby Piper. I am the founder and managing partner of Piper Smith. It's a lobbying, public relations, and crisis communications firm. We're based out of Lexington and we work statewide. And yes, this is about our fourth year doing this and probably getting close to 20 years in the industry.
Shane.
Thanks, Terry. Glad to be on here with you and Abby today. My name is Shane Noem. I'm the president and founder of Roebling Solutions, Government Relations and Lobbying. We're based in Covington, and we have offices in Frankfurt. We are an affiliate of Dinsmore & Scholl, LLP. Excited to be in this role after a career in campaigns and working for elected officials about 4 years ago as well. We launched Roebling, and we're helping out a good crop of clients with their needs in local government and state government.
Right. Need to add, Shane is also a member of the KYA board. And Shane, you know, we appreciate you being there. Shane and Abby both have so graciously given of their time before the podcast today. I think you all were part of the core blueprint convening where you kind of coached up our partners and advocates on the Frankfurt scene. So I understand in your world, work is about billable hours, and you get no billable hours out of this. So we appreciate you being here. So we felt like that it may be helpful for me to take just a few minutes and frame how I saw the 2024 session. And so I'm going to do that for a few minutes, and then we're going to get into the experts, not me, talking about how they saw the session. So we're recording this on the Monday of Derby week, which means that if I were going to use a sports analogy, it should be about Derby horses. Or, you know, given the state of basketball in the bluegrass, maybe I should be talking about the new basketball coach at the University of Louisville, or I think the school up the road in Lexington, Transylvania, UK, somebody up there, they got a new coach as well. Or if you're a golf person, you maybe are pumped up that the PGA is coming to Valhalla in Kentucky in just a week. That's what I should have been talking about. But as I look at the 2024 session, I keep thinking of the 1938 Chicago Bears, because they're the NFL team that lost more fumbles than any football team in history. And as I think about the 2024 session, there were more fumbles for kids in this session than any session I've seen in my 20 years at KYA. You know, some of those fumbles were raw politics. As an example, HB 11 was a common sense bill that had this wild idea that we would enforce the laws on the books so that your 10-year-old daughter could not buy a vape product at the corner store. Advocates from the left and the right came together the bill had such movement that it was going to happen. And in fact, if you wonder how successful it was going to be, it made big tobacco come into the state, pay an exorbitant amount of money to a highly connected lobbying group. And suddenly, what was going to protect kids became so diluted that it rendered the legislation useless. So if your sixth grade kid is buying vape products this afternoon at the corner store, you can thank the General Assembly for fumbling that opportunity. Other fumbles were created by nearsightedness from the General Assembly. As an example, there is no question that we face a burgeoning crisis in juvenile justice in Kentucky. Whether you're talking about incarceration or prevention, the entire system of juvenile justice is in chaos. And the General Assembly had an opportunity to answer maybe the toughest question of all, which is when a kid is locked up, what happens? Do we try to get him back on the right track? Or do we simply have him serve time, which is inevitably a recipe for recidivism and repeat offenses? We were close. We were close. Through budget negotiations, we saw a promising per year investment in what we hoped was get back on the right track strategies. But in the end, it didn't happen. So again, we fumbled away a chance to make a great ROI, minimal investment, big return. There were other fumbles that best can be described as dumb. I'm sorry, dumbfounding. That's what I'm supposed to say. So this is a General Assembly that ran hard on the mantra of get tough on crime. I mean, we want to criminalize homelessness. And how about this? This is a great idea. If a kid is habitually truant, let's not address root causes. Let's not engage his family. Instead, let's lock him up. So if this General Assembly wanted to be tough on populations such as the homeless or chronically truant kids, apparently there was one group that they didn't want to be tough on: perpetrators of child abuse. HB 275, simply put, would have protected students from perpetrators in schools. And SB 181, well, it had the outrageous notion of making sexual extortion a felony. The 2024 General Assembly version of Tough on Crime tackled issues that it shouldn't have tackled, and it didn't tackle issues it should have. It just makes you wonder. So if you learn next October that your son or daughter is in a classroom with a teacher who just this year was involved in an investigation around child abuse in another school district, and you wonder how this could happen, I'd encourage you to call your state representative and state senator and ask them, how did they fumble that particular issues? We can talk about other fumbles as well. For instance, while there was significant investment in early childhood, there simply was not enough. And so what people celebrate as what they perceive as a key investment, well, come July 1 of this year, 16,000 kids who now have childcare will not have it. So I want you to think about the impact of that budget decision on those kids and families. And what about local economies? So budget fumbles, policy fumbles. To be fair, along with those fumbles, there were some touchdowns. So we at KYA were absolutely delighted to see solid and thoughtful investment in kinship care. We were pleased to see a continued support of behavioral and mental health services for kids, especially those services that emanate in school-based settings. Some important and creative beginning steps were taken to address the teacher shortage. And the Momnibus bill, passed at the last moment, is such an effort to better serve pregnant moms and their babies. Those are examples of what this legislative body can do when they want to support kids. There is some promising news, however. Just 2 years after that disastrous season, the Chicago Bears won the NFL title, and they won it for 4 consecutive years. So that means that maybe, just maybe, the General Assembly can get back on the track they've been on, winning for kids. Maybe, just maybe, it means that our lawmakers will not capitulate to well-heeled lobbyists next year when it comes to kids' health. Maybe, just maybe, Kentucky policies next year will emanate from Kentucky rather than from think tanks in Colorado and Arizona and Florida and Virginia. Maybe, just maybe, our lawmakers will go upstream next year to create real solutions and real investments on issues ranging from chronic truancy to early childhood education to curbing youth vaping. George Hallis was the coach and architect who transformed those Bears from a fumble machine to world champion. And at the time, he asserted that nobody who gave their best will ever regret it. So we have an invitation today. That invitation is to President Stivers, and it's to Speaker Osborne. It's to every member of the Kentucky General Assembly. And that invitation is a simple one. Look at yourself in the mirror and ask a simple but profound question. Did I give my best for Kentucky's kids in 2024? And maybe, just maybe, an honest answer to that will yield a commitment for 2025 where the General Assembly can in fact become champions in making Kentucky the best place in America to be young. So Abby and Shane, as you saw, I wanted to be very subtle and nuanced in the report card that I was going to give the General Assembly. Shane, you also, as a board member, have heard us talk about concerns, some of which got alluded to, for instance, the nationalization of state policies. We talked about the pragmatic conundrum that I assume both of y'all face in your lobbying work, that just the pure volume of relatively new lawmakers creates lots of extra work. The notion that caucuses, I never know if more than one caucus is caucus or caucuses. So we don't know, I think the caucus are much more independent than they were even 3 or 4 years ago. So all of those are mechanistic issues that we confront. I tried to lay out sort of the disappointment, and we normally are pretty positive on what we see for kids in the General Assembly. Just got to tell you, this year is the exception. So I've kind of framed it up, and I don't necessarily want you to pivot just off what I said. We'll get back to that. But how about just some general overviews of how you saw the 2024 General Assembly? And Shane, since you've heard me talk a little bit at the board meeting, I'm going to get you to go first so you can work that in. And then Abby, you can think about how in the heck are you going to respond to this KYA sermon today?
Sounds good. Well, Terry, I'll try to do my best to follow you in analyzing the General Assembly. I watched this session, and I think it is noteworthy how many new members there are in both parties, in both chambers. There are increasingly more new members. This isn't unique to us. This is across the country. You're seeing legislators turning over and younger members coming in. I see this session. I'm a little more half full on how it turned out. I think this is a foundation building session. I think there were a lot of great things that laid the foundation for follow-up in future sessions. I look at childcare in particular. There was a historic level of funding put towards childcare for the first time in this state. Childcare Ready Communities is going to focus on local government's role in childcare and the childcare crisis really that we have in the state. The Early Childhood Employer Assistance Program, making that a permanent program. A lot of employers were not interested in being a part of it if it was a temporary pilot program. That's going to have a catalytic impact. Innovation funds, and my personal favorite was childcare for childcare workers. We've got a workforce problem in the childcare industry, and this is going to be a major step towards shoring up a great workforce pool that we need to make sure that our kids are watched every day. My daughter's in preschool right now, and I can only imagine if a mom wanted to be a preschool worker and then she had to also balance paying for preschool. This is a great opportunity for people to get into an industry that they love. But go on in education. We saw a lot of great things in K-12, the economic development programs that we had, and the budget reserve trust fund that was tapped into. We had transformative projects that were funded. We're not talking about a splash pad here or there. We're talking about truly economic development programs that are going to have catalytic impacts on our Commonwealth for decades to come. And while we're talking a lot about policies that impact kids that are kids today, we need to have a job market and an economy that is great for kids that become adults 10, 15, 20 years from now. And I think that's what you saw this General Assembly and Speaker Osborne and President Stivers focusing on, were things that are going to have catalytic impacts on the Commonwealth for a generation.
Thanks, Shane. Isn't it great that at least one of us is so diplomatic? And Abby is too. So, Abby, I'm going to give you a plug because you know that along with 800 sports podcast, I would not miss Kentucky Politics Weekly. And for those of you who don't listen, Abby and a couple other folks are on there on a weekly basis and give you hysterical jokes, but also some acute analysis of the General Assembly. So I was telling you off camera, I listened to your Tuesday after Sine Die podcast, and you felt pretty good about the session. So I want to hear about it from your perspective, and that's what we want. You're on here to talk about your view, not to agree with me.
Well, Terry, first of all, there are a lot of wins. Any session, you're going to have wins, you're going to have losses. But, as someone who's worked in education policy for a long, long time, public education advocates typically have more losses than they have wins. And that is simply a byproduct of that national rhetoric you're talking about and national dollars and that model legislation coming from other think tanks that have no reference point whatsoever for Kentucky. But it's a very complex area of policy. And because of that, it moves slow. And so for those of us who are impatient, patience is not one of my virtues. It does feel like a lot of losses. But I thought we had some great wins. And, first of all, House Bill 5, you can land on either side of the homelessness argument. But to be honest with you, it had some really good components in it. I mean, making carjacking a violent crime, that's needed. Increasing penalties for fentanyl trafficking, that's needed and will help our families and our children. So, it's one of those, you got to take the good with the bad and take progress as you can. And that bill would not have passed, I don't believe, without the homelessness component. So, there's that. I would also say the truancy one as well. That is something that educators ask for because we call parents. They call parents and the parents don't answer in a lot of cases. And so, districts have absolutely no recourse other than to just contact the parents and contact the parents and contact the parents, and nothing changes. So having, a court process in place, which frankly, like you said, this is just honestly implementing the law, keep making sure people follow the law, which is if you have a child under the age of 18, that child has to go to school. And you're legally responsible for that child. And it's unfortunate that we've gotten to a position where we have to legislate that. But the truth is, if it gets more children back in school, that's a win for kids. I do agree with you. I think the Momnibus was a fantastic bill. And I'm glad that some of the more stringent and I would say, partisan pieces came off of it at the end. Anytime you got an omnibus bill of any kind, it's a bit of a Christmas tree, and it picks up stuff along the way. So I loved that they really worked hard to keep it clean, and I think the fact that it passed on the last day is proof that it was a hard haul. I mean, it was a long haul to make sure everybody was happy with that. The other thing I'll say is teacher recruitment, education funding, great, but there were significant investments in the one-time arena, which obviously was part of the rainy day fund allocation, in things like clean water. We have a lot of kiddos in our rural areas who still do. It's 2024 and still do not have access to clean water coming out of the pipes at home. That's an embarrassment. And honestly, I can't believe we're still having this conversation. But a lot of those water systems, water treatment plants, they've gotten old, they've gotten outdated, or in some cases, like in the example of the city of Everett's, the population grew and the tank did not, right? And so some of those infrastructure pieces are actually very, very important. I do think that you're both correct in that the environment is just different. We have a lot of new legislators, but that has kind of been the trend since 2016, just as the GOP caucus has grown in both chambers. But the other thing we have a lot of people in the GOP caucus now, more than we've ever had, to my knowledge. So 80 people out of 100 in the House in the GOP caucus. I mean, they struggled to find a room they could caucus in that would fit 80 people plus staff. And then even on the Senate side, the Senate caucus room that's 31 people. So you have that, but you also have what we have never seen before, which is a deep, deep fissure and multiple cracks that are starting to grow within the GOP party. And that's emblematic of the national trends as well. But Republicans are starting to shift in multiple directions. And that's a natural byproduct of having so many people. But it's really hard to keep 80 people. I don't want Stephen Rudy's job for anything. That's a really tough job. And there's a lot of people and a lot of different personalities to keep. And so when you have that dynamic, I think, too, it is very difficult to pass legislation because you have to get so many people on board. The other thing I'll say is it's a budget year. And money matters. Money talks. And I don't know if you remember, Terry, I'm sure you do, a few years back when they were passing charter school legislation, and I know specifically at least one case where a legislator was going to be a no on that legislation and turned on the last minute because a multi-million-dollar project that was allocated to her or him in the budget was going to be pulled. And so
I'm shocked. I'm shocked at
that. We've seen several years in a row now where charter school or school choice legislation has only passed because they've held full-day kindergarten hostage, right? So I do want to say, I think it was a great session. I think they did a lot. I think they did a lot of what they wanted to do. Are there places we still need to go? Yeah. But I think the greatest disappointment is one that it really is a responsibility for all of us, which is there's so much money in politics. And until we figure out how to really, Kentuckians should make Kentucky policy. And I'm not sure how we backtrack on that, but I think that doing that would help address a lot of the things that you have expressed.
Yeah, great. Thanks for both of that. Shane, I'm kind of interested, and you also can pass on it because I know that you also happen to be chair of a Republican party in a certain county, so I don't want to put you on the spot. But we certainly have talked. What Abby raised was that this notion that there's just Democrats and Republicans is a little naive. I'm old and decrepit enough that I remember that these same conversations used to happen about Democrats. You had very far left Democrats. That's not good or bad, just saying they were. And then you had, I think, what typically got called yellow dog Democrats, many of whom were more conservative than the most liberal Republicans. So we kind of have this flip. And part of what I think folks try to figure out is that sociology of any party. Abby raised that clearly, if you want to pass policy in Kentucky, the party you got to be concerned about is the Republican Party. I'm interested going a little bit deeper in what Abby was talking about. If both of you want to talk about how you see that typology what unifies, the fissures, and most importantly, what folks as advocates for kids, what we can learn from that. Because what we've got to do, we're not going to change that environment. What we got to learn to do is navigate it better.
Yeah. It's an interesting time to be involved in public policy and politics in this country. I would say if we were an 80-20 state Democrat, I think you would see similar fissures in the Democratic Party.
Absolutely.
I always joke that I'm comforted that we've got some challenges in our party to work through. The other side's got theirs too. So it's not just us. I am the chairman of the Kenton County Republican Party, the largest Republican majority county in the state, and we see these discussions happen on a local level. You got urban, rural, you've got suburban, you've got moderate liberal, you've got hard conservative, you've got evangelical conservative, libertarian conservative, so many different brands. And what's great about the Republican Party is it's a big tent party. There is room for everybody. Doesn't mean we're always going to get along. Doesn't mean we should get along. These are good policy debates to be having, is what is the right policy for Kentucky's kids and Kentucky's families. And I think that's what you're seeing is a little bit of the growing pains of being, we flipped in 2016, which was long overdue from redistricting. Now we're seeing a kind of the cresting. What's the majority, the max that we're going to have with the new maps that we've got. So you'll see over the next session or two, kind of the shaking out of the different camps. But at the end of the day, I think this leadership team and the House in particular, the Senate just naturally works more cohesively when you only have 38 members. But in the House in particular, this leadership team does a really good job of knowing where their members are. Speaker Osborne runs a really great House, and he knows his members. And he really, they've got a great team that whips votes. And as far as how to analyze this for policies that impact kids, I think there are a lot of opportunities. No legislator doesn't care about kids. Let's just be honest. They might have a voting record that is challenging for advocates for children, but everybody cares about kids. And I think it's understanding where the libertarian wing is coming from and protecting liberties as a foundational base for governing, so that they can protect kids in other aspects of their life, and explaining to different groups the role of childcare and the role of women in the workforce, and understanding where the evangelical community is coming from on childcare and the role of the church in childcare. I think that's what we should take away, is an understanding and appreciation that there are different perspectives, but it's healthy to have the discussions. But at the end of the day, we've got to vote, and you got to pick a side, and hopefully you're on the winning side.
Yeah, great answer. Abby, you want to riff a little bit more from the point you initially made and then follow up with Shane? Is when you look at the Kentucky Republicans, think about those dichotomies, what they agree on, what they don't, and what does it mean to folks who are in Frankfort working on behalf of kids?
Yeah, and I will follow up by saying Shane's right. Speaker Osborne has done an undoable job. I don't know how he stays so calm. He still is able to make jokes. He's doing some really tough sledding. And I have continued to have respect for him. But this session, kind of up close and personal, saw him really do the hard work. And so I do want to say that. So I believe there are basically 4 different kinds of, 3 or 4, depending on how you classify them, different Republicans in Kentucky right now. And obviously you mentioned the evangelical. I call that lovingly the preacher caucus, because many of them are actually preachers. And then you've got your sort of liberty group. So I normally classify that kind of northern Kentucky and a little, coming down a little bit south there. Then you have your just small government people, just get the government out of everything. And sometimes they bleed in with the liberty candidates, sometimes they don't. But then you've got your country club Republicans, and those are like your Ronald Reagan Republicans, the Republicans that I grew up around, right? And they're about governance that protects people but stays out of the way, right? But I think even what makes it so complicated is that every issue, when you put that many personalities around it, not to mention the Democrats, it gets so complex and it slows everything down. For example, House Bill 275, Terry, you mentioned earlier on, the investigations against teachers who may have been alleged to have had sexual misconduct. From a liberty perspective, that bill really struggled because it put due process on its heels a bit. And there are teachers in this Commonwealth who have been accused of things that they have never done. And so having that on their permanent record, that's not helpful. On the other hand, we do need to know when that has happened and when those claims have been substantiated. And I think, but that could be seen as over legislating. And so, it becomes very, very difficult, I think, to bridge those gaps. But there are areas like public education that affect children that do blend over those. And one example that I will say is, the Preacher Caucus, they're pro-public schools in almost every case because they're in rural areas. And rural areas are most likely to have public school districts as the top or one of the top employers in their counties. And so, that's a bleed over where you see Republicans in rural areas that vote pro-public school, but may vote with the rest of the caucus on everything else. And I'm making it sound like Republicans are not pro-public school, but the way that the school choice, which I actually think is school privatization, but for clarity, they call it school choice, that has created that division there.
I'm curious, and I want to be cognizant of time because I know we're not going to do a 2-hour podcast. I'd like to, but my communications people won't let me. So I'm curious if you can answer, and I thought your analysis of the supermajority was spot on and really very, very helpful to our viewers. Part of what I'm curious about is thinking about, are there unifying cornerstone values that all those Republicans can believe in and we can wrap policy around? An example that I would give you is that I would suggest respectfully that 4 or 5 years ago, a North Star for Republicans was local control. So, local control. And even this session, we heard that fluoride for kids' mouths was a local control issue, which I'm not quite sure of. Something that I actually agreed with was this notion that school districts need flexibility in increased SEEK funding more than categorical allocations that you've got to give raises or textbooks or football helmets out. So I get that local control. And yet other issues are very unlocal control. The one that I hear all the time in education is there are school districts, got it by research and from places like, the U.S. Secret Service that talks about that law enforcement personnel in schools don't mitigate school shootings. I mean, that's just the research. And again, I think most folks would agree U.S. Secret Service, which is the leading voice on that, is not exactly a radical left-wing group, but they talk about the need for behavioral mental health support, student connections. Yet it's interesting that when it comes to that really important issue, school districts that want to go a different direction don't get to, right? Because everybody is going to follow the same formula for SROs or guardians or whatever the label might be. So that gives me some seasickness because if local control is always the North Star, whether you agree or disagree, you can count on it. It seems like it's kind of like we're for local control unless we're not for local control. And there's some other measures that I think historically Republicans, especially Senate Republicans, have said this is our standard. And I just wonder, so I'm wondering if the diversity of voices mean there are not North Stars or there are North Stars that maybe I'm not aware of that I should be. So Abby, you want to take the first bite at that apple? What are the cornerstone beliefs that every Republican is going to say, you can count on me for that?
Yeah, I think the big one is fiscally conservative. I think Petrie has done an incredible job of trying to pass what he calls a responsible budget. And, we did have wish list items. I mean, universal pre-K would be great, but it's an ongoing cost, right? And so when we talk about these big infrastructure projects that like clean water that we referenced, that came out of a surplus of basically our savings account. We had extra in there we didn't need, but we can't commit that to ongoing funds. And quite frankly, I think that's what Bashir 1 did. And I think that has put us in the position we're in on pensions. Speaking of which, they bolstered that as well. There is some flexibility at the local level for school funding, but you're right, Terry. And one of the big losses there was mental health services providers. And it wasn't too long ago that was a bell ringer. Like everybody we knew was like, we got to get more mental health services to kiddos. The question is, are they willing to pay for it? So that one I think may have fallen off. I mean, it's like Sean says, everybody wants kids to be successful, but you got to pay for it. And I think that fiscally conservative bent is probably I would say maybe the only thing left that is that goes across all of those lines.
And I think, Abby, correct me, or Shane, correct me if I'm wrong, and I actually agree with this hypothesis, which is what I saw going on, is that if we had extra money, we're going to spend that on one-time allocations, because to commit to reoccurring expenses out of sort of that bonus puts us behind the 8 ball in 2 years, or certainly in 4 and 8. So I think it's important to listeners to understand. I think that was a dividing line, that we're going to support recurring expenses through normal revenue, and we're not going to use bonus bucks for that. Is that a fair assessment?
I believe so.
Shane, what about it? When we're thinking about crafting legislation, what is that supermajority? What are they going to say? At least maybe not 100%, 98.1% are going to say, yes, we agree with that principle or value.
Yeah. Well, Abby said she doesn't want to be Stephen Rudy. I wouldn't mind that job, but I don't want to be the appropriations chairs. Chairman McDaniel, Chairman Petrie, they have an incredible job to do, and I think this budget reflected their thoughtful approach to budgeting, and it really reflected that commonality amongst the Republicans, is focusing on transformative economic development, long-term projects. Looking at the budget and looking at the conversation the last couple of years over lowering the income tax, the race to zero as responsibly as possible with the stair steps and the triggers in there. We've seen other states go before us and make mistakes, and these two gentlemen in particular have helped lead a thoughtful process on how to do that. That's going to have generational impacts. That's going to really set Kentucky's economy on fire. Investing in the regions that are growing and looking at the regions that are not growing. I think one of the noteworthy things for Kentucky students are this idea of 4-year college in Hazard, Southeast Kentucky, and bringing economic resources to a region that has really done a turnover on their, the coal-based economy, and now looking at tourism and agritourism and different things that'll be the future of Eastern Kentucky. The conversation about the veterinarian program at Murray, I know it didn't get across the finish line this year, but these higher education investments, we've got to get to kids younger and younger and have greater impacts on the younger audience, but it's important to look at our workforce. The other piece that we started talking about this session that I think could be a commonality for a lot of Republicans is this notion of housing. We have a housing crisis. Everything's a crisis, right? But we have a housing crisis in Kentucky and across the country. We don't have enough units for those that need them. And the conversation is now shifted to income-aligned housing. We're not talking about affordable. We're not talking about any particular kind. We need more houses of all levels. And I think you started to see that conversation start. We didn't go in the right direction in every case, but I think you're going to see more and more conversations about how do we craft policy to incentivize housing development and get out of the way. Republicans love getting out of the way of letting developers and businesses do their thing. And I think housing is one space that they're going to want to come back to and look at again so that we can get families in houses they can afford and make them more independent.
That's great. Got one final question. And again, I just so appreciate your insight and time. I'm thinking about that person who cares about kids, and they're watching this and they're hearing lots of different views, but they've got a particular issue or perspective that they want to be heard. I worry all the time that so many folks who follow us, I don't know if unempowered is a word, but if it were, they feel unempowered. So I want you to inspire and coach them up. I've just heard one of y'all or somebody else talk about an issue, and you're either befuddled that it didn't happen, or you're glad it did, or you got an idea. To me, this is such a prime time to get those ideas bubbling in Frankfort. What should they do? So Shane, somebody's watching you and they're like, man, he just said something that sparked my imagination. What do they do with that right now?
Well, first, don't keep it to yourself. Get out there, share that idea. The more people that you can engage and share the great idea that you have, the better. These folks are not, I love everybody in the General Assembly, but they're not mythical creatures. I think far too often we put them on pedestals and you can't reach them and they're scary. I mean, you've got everybody from nurses, used car salesmen, teachers, retirees, grandparents. They're like your neighbors. If you've never met a legislator, they are normal people. Don't be afraid to reach out to them. They want to talk to you. They want to listen to you. They may not agree with you. They may think your idea is stupid. Okay. There's 137 other legislators that might think you have a great idea. So make sure you just don't be afraid of getting engaged in the process. Get engaged in your local parties and make your ideas heard. That's how we run this process of communal governance.
Right. Thanks. Abby, what about it?
Well, you've heard me say this before, and I'm sure it's an unpopular opinion, but just be fearless. So much, I say this all the time, so much relies on adults getting it right for kids. So much. And it requires all of us. We all have a voice. We all have a responsibility to use it. And quite frankly, your legislators want to hear from you. They really do. They want to know what you're interested in. They want to know what concerns you have, what you're happy about, what you're proud of. They want to know all those things. And I mean, he's exactly right. They are really just people. I mean, we call them representative and senator, and they are elected to hold those positions of power, but they're normal people and they want to hear from you. So I would say just be fearless and tell them what you need, what you're interested in, what you want to see for the future of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And just look at it as if, quite frankly, you got to be respectful, but this is a responsibility as a citizen that you have. You know how to find them. And if you don't, go to lrc.ky.gov, click on the Find My Legislator. They'll give you the email. They'll give you the phone numbers. They'll have the Twitter handles. Just go and do, and don't look back.
And I think it's safe to say most folks would be really surprised how responsive a senator or a representative is to their constituent. Now, if you're reaching 5 counties over, you may not get it quite as quick, but I really want to encourage you to do that. So there are a couple wrap-ups before I formally thank Abby and Shane. So along with, I think Abby would agree, along with listening to Kentucky Politics Weekly, there's some other things that I want you to be aware of. So we're going to be dropping a series of specifically focused policy arena podcast in the next coming weeks. That's going to reflect what happened in health or child welfare or K-12 this last session. And as we already start thinking about next year, what are we leaning toward? The other thing we're embracing full on is the constitutional amendment around school choice. Some of you are aware, Shane, I know you are, that this fall we brought in a Pulitzer Prize winning author who has crafted the book, The Death of Public School. And we had a great discussion. We had champions of choice and champions of the coming amendment, both advocates and also legislators. And we had the other side of the coin who believe that school choice and specifically that amendment is just a terrible idea. Our commitment on that amendment, at least for the time being, is to try to facilitate civic discourse. So you can be watching for a major feature where, again, we're going to have elected officials on both sides of that coin and community-based advocates on both sides of that coin. We're also hoping to bring in a couple national guns to talk about that. And it's those kind of activities that we really want you to invite you to participate in so that you really are up to speed. When you hear somebody talking about what that amendment does and what that amendment doesn't do, we want you to really know what's on the table. So Abby and Shane, I cannot thank you enough. You provided insight and authenticity. You countered my vinegar with some honey. It's always good to have that mix. And to those of you who are joining us, thanks so much. Again, I'm Terry Brooks, and this is another issue of Making Kids Count. Thanks again. Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to the Making Kids Count podcast with Terry Brooks. For more information and to listen to more episodes, visit kyouth.org/podcast. Kentucky Youth Advocates is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization who doesn't accept government money so that we can remain truly independent. To support this podcast and our mission as the independent voice for Kentucky kids, please consider making a gift at kyouth.org/donate.